The Japanese naval aviators who ascended into the skies during the initial months of the Pacific War held a firmly established conviction that America's Navy was dispersed, feeble and confined to the coastline. Their training, briefings, and even the propaganda they encountered had consistently reinforced this perception. While the United States may have had some warships, it was perceived to lack the resolve and infrastructure necessary to confront the battle-hardened forces of the Imperial Japanese Navy in open waters. Japanese strategists had highlighted the superiority of their own aircraft carriers, which had demonstrated their effectiveness during the audacious strike on Pearl Harbor. However, what few Japanese pilots anticipated was that the Americans would retaliate, not with a mere handful of vessels, but with an apparently unending array of floating airstrips that emerged wherever the battle shifted. In the earliest encounters, Japanese aviators often described the sensation as uncanny. They would approach a contested island or a convoy, expecting to easily overcome weak defenses, only to witness squadrons of American planes rising from the horizon. Those aircraft, they later understood, did not originate from land bases situated hundreds of miles away, but from ships, massive flat-topped carriers that served as mobile airfields. For pilots who had meticulously studied maps and distances, the sudden emergence of American fighters in regions deemed beyond U.S. reach appeared almost supernatural. They began to refer to these vessels as phantom islands, floating in locations where no island should exist. Initially, the Japanese pilots did not fully comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. During the raids in the South Pacific in early 1942, reconnaissance crews would return with reports of multiple American carriers operating in unison. Commanders dismissed some of these reports as exaggerations. After all, Japanese intelligence had estimated that the United States possessed only a limited number of such ships. The logical conclusion was that once a few had been sunk, the remaining vessels could be tracked and eliminated. The prevailing belief was that Japan could sustain air superiority in any sector by systematically eliminating the carriers one at a time. However, as the months progressed, this illusion rapidly diminished. Japanese aviators who had engaged in missions against one American task force would subsequently be dispatched to another area, only to confront yet another formidable group of carriers. It appeared that regardless of how many battles the Japanese triumphed in, or how many reports of damaged carriers they received, new ones continued to emerge. Pilots returning to their bases began to express their frustration in hushed tones. How many of these floating airstrips do the Americans possess? The design of the U.S. carriers left a profound impact. Japanese pilots, who were accustomed to their own vessels with smaller decks and limited capacity, were astonished by the size and efficiency of the American ships. They accommodated more aircraft, launched them more swiftly, and recovered them with remarkable precision. Even in turbulent seas, these vessels maintained a steady rhythm of continuous sorties. Japanese aviators recalled watching in disbelief as waves of American fighters and dive bombers seemed to emerge endlessly from the decks, replenished immediately as losses occurred. The visual impact was overwhelming. For every plane a Japanese pilot managed to shoot down, two more appeared to rise from the ocean's surface. Compounding the shock was the coordination among these carriers. While Japan often deployed its carriers in smaller, concentrated groups, the Americans excelled in the art of task forces, with carriers protected by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. This layered defense meant that Japanese pilots could seldom approach closely enough to strike the carriers directly. Instead, they found themselves engaged in dogfights with swarms of protective fighters or facing walls of anti-aircraft fire. Survivors frequently acknowledged that even when they inflicted damage, the carriers seemed to recover swiftly, patched and reinforced by their support vessels. These initial encounters sowed the seeds of dread that steadily grew within the Japanese Air Corps. They came to understand that the Pacific was no longer merely an expanse of unoccupied distances where their superior training could ensure success. With America's mobile air bases, any section of the ocean could transform into a combat zone. Each horizon could hide another wave of aircraft. What the Japanese had perceived as their decisive edge, naval aviation, was being equaled and ultimately outdone by an adversary they had underestimated. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be minimized. For pilots nurtured in a culture of honor and sacrifice, recognizing that the enemy possessed a seemingly limitless weapon system was a source of humiliation. Letters retrieved post-war reveal how frequently aviators expressed skepticism regarding America's ability to deploy carriers with such speed and magnitude. One pilot lamented that the ocean itself appeared to belong to the enemy. For wherever we navigate, their floating islands rise to obstruct us. By the conclusion of 1942, the perception of the United States as a remote, reluctant power had been shattered. The Japanese aviators, who had once considered their victories inevitable, now confronted a new reality. They were engaged in combat with an opponent whose navy transported entire airfields, an opponent for whom distance held no significance. The era of battleships dominating the seas had concluded. The age of carriers, relentless and proliferating, had begun. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviators experienced an exhilarating sense of victory. They had struck at the core of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and by their assessment, incapacitated American naval power for the foreseeable future. The smoldering wrecks of battleships in the harbor served as sufficient evidence for Tokyo that their audacious gamble had succeeded. However, within weeks, fissures began to appear in that illusion. Despite the destruction caused on December 7, 1941, there were conspicuous absences in the debris. The American aircraft carriers were not present. They had been at sea, shielded from the inferno that consumed their sister ships. At that moment, Japanese leaders were not excessively worried. Their intelligence indicated that America had only a limited fleet of carriers, and they were convinced these would be tracked down and eliminated just as effortlessly as the anchored fleet at Pearl Harbor. The pilots themselves received briefings infused with the same level of confidence. In their perspective, Pearl Harbor represented the critical blow, and they believed America would lack both the determination and the resources to recover swiftly. However, in truth, the survival of those carriers signified the onset of a reversal that no Japanese aviator could fully grasp at that moment. The Japanese airmen who took part in raids across the Pacific in the months following Pearl Harbor were astonished to find out how rapidly those absent carriers re-emerged in combat. Where they anticipated sporadic resistance, they instead encountered organized American carrier groups retaliating against Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands by early 1942. Although these operations were minor compared to later campaigns, they sent shockwaves through Japanese pilots. They had been informed that the enemy was incapacitated, yet here were floating airstrips deploying bombers and fighters into the skies above territories that were supposedly secured by Japan. As the campaign progressed, disbelief intensified. Japanese pilots engaged at Coral Sea in May 1942 were the first to understand what it meant to face an adversary whose carriers had not only survived Pearl Harbor, but had also increased in strength. For the first time in naval history, two rival carrier forces clashed without their surface ships ever firing directly at one another. Instead, waves of aircraft filled the skies, battling for dominance. Japanese flyers emerged both impressed and unsettled. The Americans had adapted with remarkable speed, unifying their carriers into a single striking force. After Coral Sea, even those Japanese aviators who claimed tactical victories felt the dawning realization that America's industrial power was beginning to manifest. Reports circulated among the ranks indicating that new carriers were already being constructed in American shipyards. For pilots who had been raised with the conviction that the construction of such vessels demanded significant time and effort, the notion of replacements already in progress seemed almost surreal. However, it was indeed a reality. Pearl Harbor did not signify the end of America's carrier fleet. Rather, it ignited a surge of expansion unprecedented in the Pacific. Correspondence and personal journals documented the increasing anxiety. A Japanese pilot reflecting on his experiences in the spring of 1942 expressed an unsettling sense of déjà vu. No matter where we traveled, the same flat-topped adversaries emerged. We would sink one, only for another to take its place. Such feelings were not mere exaggerations, but rather a growing recognition that Japan had underestimated both the resilience and the productive capabilities of its adversary. The disparity between Japanese expectations and reality could not have been more pronounced. Pearl Harbor was intended to deliver a decisive blow, yet it instead resulted in a scenario where America's remaining carriers became the focal point of a new naval strategy. Japanese pilots who had previously dismissed American aviation found themselves engaged in dogfights with skilled and determined foes who became increasingly proficient with each encounter. By mid-1942, the long-held belief in the inevitability of Japanese supremacy at sea had dissipated. The psychological conflict was significant. In their perception, Pearl Harbor represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation, a testament to their dominance. Yet the very lack of carriers during that assault had sown the seeds of their downfall. Instead of eliminating America's ability to project power, Pearl Harbor compelled the United States to depend on its carriers, invest heavily in them, and elevate their status to a central role in naval warfare. Japanese pilots undertaking missions in increasingly perilous skies could only observe as the enemy they had presumed defeated returned with greater strength and audacity, with those floating airstrips appearing in waters that should have been under Japanese control. The Japanese launched unrelenting assaults, deploying waves of Zero fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes against the enemy task forces. However, despite the intensity of the attacks, the carriers persisted. Pilots returning from missions frequently recounted experiences of surreal frustration. They had navigated through intense anti-aircraft fire, engaged in exhausting dogfights with American fighters, and released torpedoes against large aircraft carriers, only to later learn that the enemy had not been significantly harmed. Even carriers that sustained damage appeared to recover with alarming rapidity, their flight decks repaired and their squadrons restocked. One weary aviator reportedly remarked, "The American carriers are like weeds. They spring back no matter how often we cut them." What troubled the Japanese airmen the most was the rhythm of American operations. The carriers did not operate in isolation. They functioned within coordinated task groups, each shielded by cruisers and destroyers that created concentric defensive rings. Pilots diving toward a carrier would first face the flak from escorts, then engage with intercepting fighters, and only if they survived would they attempt their attack run. Even in the rare instances when a bomb found its target, the Americans seemed to absorb the impact, retreat momentarily, and then rejoin the fray. The Japanese formed the impression that these floating airstrips were invulnerable, not due to being indestructible, but because they were inexhaustible. As the months wore on, this understanding took a toll on morale. Japanese pilots conducting missions from Rabaul and other bases began to fear the unavoidable confrontations with American carriers. Their letters and diaries reflect a growing sense of despair. One veteran described the skies over Guadalcanal as a graveyard for our finest men, observing how many comrades disappeared in flames while the enemy continued to deploy fresh squadrons. One individual recalled the unsettling sight of American fighter planes arriving to intercept his formation almost immediately after they were detected on radar, as if the enemy could summon aircraft at will. Guadalcanal also unveiled another aspect of American carrier warfare that disturbed Japanese pilots: endurance. Japanese carriers, with their limited capacity and reduced logistical support, faced challenges in sustaining extended operations. Their crews and aircraft became fatigued rapidly. Replacement personnel were few, and fuel shortages became critical. In contrast, the Americans appeared to rotate their carriers in and out of combat effortlessly, relying on supply lines that extended back across the Pacific and never seemed to waver. For the Japanese aviators observing from their cockpits, this difference was astonishing. It indicated that while they battled at the brink of exhaustion, the Americans could persist in the fight indefinitely. By the time the Guadalcanal campaign reached its brutal conclusion in early 1943, the lesson was firmly ingrained in the minds of Japanese flyers. They had come to realize that America's floating airstrips were not temporary incursions, but rather permanent fixtures of the Pacific theater. No matter where they looked, another carrier group emerged. The pilots who once believed that their training and valor could triumph over any adversary now faced a nightmare characterized by industrial scale and strategic tenacity. To them, the carriers had transformed into more than mere ships. They had become emblems of an enemy whose reach was limitless. For the Japanese airmen who endured those harrowing months, Guadalcanal was remembered not merely as a battle for a single island, but as the moment they understood that the ocean itself belonged to the carriers. The illusion of easy victories had evaporated, replaced by the stark realization that America's floating airstrips were altering the rules of warfare, and that the pilots of the rising sun were now contending with a tide they could not reverse. Behind every sortie conducted by Japanese aviators and every confrontation with those formidable American carriers lay a reality they could hardly comprehend. The United States possessed an industrial apparatus that was unlike anything Japan had ever encountered. In the months following the onset of war, Japanese pilots frequently speculated about the number of carriers their adversary could possibly sustain. The common belief was that only a few remained operational after Pearl Harbor, and that, with enough effort, they could be tracked down and destroyed. However, the war unveiled a far more disconcerting truth. America was capable of replacing its carriers more swiftly than Japan could eliminate them. Moreover, each new vessel appeared larger, more sophisticated, and more efficiently operated than its predecessor. For pilots who endured daily life in the confined spaces of Japanese bases in Rabaul, Trau, or the Solomons, it was unimaginable to conceive of the extensive assembly lines in California, Virginia, and New York. Yet those factories represented the concealed battlegrounds of the Pacific. While Japanese industry depended on skilled artisans laboring meticulously over each new vessel, the Americans had perfected the technique of mass production. Shipyards such as Newport News and the naval facilities in Brooklyn were producing carriers with remarkable speed. Each one was launched in months rather than years. To the Japanese airmen who repeatedly witnessed the same silhouettes of American carriers emerging on the horizon, the experience was disorienting, an illusion of invincibility, when in reality it was the result of an industrial base operating at full capacity. Equally astonishing was the magnitude of America's logistical capabilities. Japanese pilots noted that their own navy struggled to sustain long-range operations, hampered by fuel shortages and stretched supply lines. In contrast, American carriers never appeared to deplete their fuel, ammunition, or aircraft. Every engagement was supported by oilers, repair ships, and tenders, all constituting a vast mobile infrastructure that ensured the survival of the floating airstrips, regardless of how far they ventured. For aviators familiar with the fragility of their own fleet, this resilience was nearly unfathomable. It seemed as though the Americans had found a method to transform the sea into their homeland, allowing their carriers to remain in constant motion. The industrial equilibrium was further illustrated by the number of aircraft. Japanese carriers, although impressive in their initial years, carried a smaller number of planes and necessitated lengthy, meticulous preparations for both launch and recovery. In contrast, American carriers accommodated larger complements, rotated squadrons with accuracy, and appeared to replenish aircraft losses almost instantaneously. Japanese pilots observed that following a fierce battle in which they claimed numerous enemy kills, the subsequent engagement would still present fresh American squadrons as if the prior encounter had never occurred. This continuity fostered a sense of despair. "We fight shadows," one pilot lamented in his diary. "No matter how many we destroy, more appear, as if conjured by the factories across the ocean." The disparity in repair and recovery further widened the divide. Japanese carriers struck by bombs or torpedoes frequently required weeks for repairs, with many never returning at all. Conversely, American carriers, even when damaged in combat, seemed to reappear in remarkably short time frames. Pilots would receive reports of a carrier being hit, only to encounter it again within months, fully operational and filled with new aircraft. For the men who risked their lives navigating through flak and enemy fighters, this was nothing less than demoralizing. It created the haunting impression that American carriers were not merely ships, but entities that regenerated faster than they could be destroyed. The psychological impact of this disparity steadily increased. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots referred to America's floating airstrips as a hydra. Cut off one head and two more would emerge. Their commanders endeavored to sustain morale by highlighting Japan's superior fighting spirit and the individual prowess of its aviators. Yet spirit could not make up for factories that operated without rest. The Japanese Naval Air Arm was losing its most seasoned personnel, while the United States was training replacements in large quantities, continuously integrating them into the unending cycle of carrier operations. In hindsight, the impact of American industrial strength was as crucial as any individual battle. Japanese aviators lacked access to production figures or intelligence assessments that outlined the extent of their adversaries' shipbuilding efforts. All they possessed were their own observations, which conveyed a clear narrative. The Americans had transformed the Pacific into a chessboard of mobile airfields, and regardless of how intensely the Japanese attacked, the floating airstrips proliferated. Each confrontation reinforced the same understanding. The conflict was no longer merely between pilots and vessels, but rather between entire economies. In that struggle, Japan had no chance of success. For the pilots who engaged in those fierce battles, the industrial powerhouse supporting the American carriers was unseen yet ever present. It represented the hidden adversary that loomed over every mission, the reason the floating airstrips never vanished, and the rationale behind the Pacific appearing to be filled with endless decks emerging from the ocean. For many, the realization arrived too late. Their bravery and expertise, though undeniable, were being overwhelmed by a war machine whose magnitude was beyond comprehension. By the time the protracted campaign across the Solomon Islands commenced, Japanese naval aviators were starting to comprehend the daunting tenacity of the American carriers. The skies over locations such as Tulagi, New Georgia, and Bougainville were engulfed in flames and smoke, as Japanese and American squadrons engaged in daily confrontations. Yet, no matter how many sorties the Japanese undertook, the American floating airstrips never appeared to diminish. For pilots conditioned to perceive decisive battles as singular strikes that would conclude resistance, the reality of combating an enemy with limitless resources was devastating. Letters and remnants of diaries that endured the war illustrate a striking depiction of this despair. Japanese pilots documented their impending missions with the feeling that they were entering a tempest they could not possibly quell. One aviator remarked bitterly that the enemy's carriers resembled mountains adrift on the ocean. They neither sink nor depart. Another pilot articulated the experience of confronting wave after wave of American fighters, as akin to attempting to slice the wind with a sword. These contemplations reveal more than mere frustration. They demonstrate how morale was eroded by the continual sight of American carriers emerging over every horizon. The Solomons also underscored the cumulative impact of attrition. Japanese naval aviation had commenced the war with an elite group of exceptionally trained pilots, yet those ranks were diminishing with each passing month. Casualties over Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, and numerous skirmishes had depleted many of the seasoned veterans. The individuals who succeeded them were less experienced, trained hastily, and frequently sent into combat before they had mastered the complex skills required for carrier operations. Opposing them were American squadrons that not only appeared inexhaustible, but were also steadily enhancing their proficiency. Each new cohort of aviators trained in the United States entered combat with assurance and discipline, bolstered by the extensive resources of their fleet. For Japanese pilots, this expanding disparity became a psychological snare. They recognized that their own numbers were diminishing, while the Americans seemed to only increase. The floating airstrips epitomized that imbalance. Each time they endeavored to isolate a convoy or gain control of an island, the emergence of a carrier group disrupted their strategies. Even when the Japanese succeeded in inflicting damage, crippling a cruiser, and downing numerous enemy aircraft, the American carriers simply advanced, launching new strikes as if nothing had transpired. The resilience exhibited was exasperating, gnawing at the confidence of the men who had once held a belief in the invincibility of the rising sun. Reports from the Solomons indicate that Japanese squadrons were compelled to undertake desperate night operations executing long and exhausting missions from remote bases in an effort to circumvent the carriers. Nevertheless, the Americans adapted even in such circumstances. They enhanced radar detection, deployed night fighters, and expanded their escort fleets, rendering it nearly impossible for Japanese aircraft to launch strikes without facing resistance. Pilots who succeeded in returning from these missions recounted the futility of their endeavors, fighting against an enemy that always appeared prepared, well-supplied, and unyielding. It was during these campaigns that the myth of American fragility was completely dispelled. The Japanese had entered the conflict under the impression that their adversary was too soft, too unprepared, and too distant to withstand a prolonged struggle. The Solomons demonstrated otherwise. The floating airstrips served as a daily reminder that the United States could not only endure, but also achieve dominance. The islands themselves seemed to diminish in significance, becoming mere pawns on a vast chessboard, while the carriers, those mobile airfields capable of appearing anywhere, dictated the pace of warfare. One pilot, expressing despair after a failed raid, articulated it succinctly. "We fight not against men, but against factories. Each time we believe we have severed the enemy's arm, another emerges." Such statements reveal the deep psychological damage inflicted by the constant presence of the carriers. It was not merely that the Americans possessed more ships, but that those vessels symbolized an entire industrial civilization dedicated to a singular purpose. For the Japanese airmen, who fought at the limits of their endurance, it felt akin to battling the ocean itself, an unending and unstoppable force. As the Solomons campaign extended into late 1943, the cumulative toll became intolerable. Morale diminished, confidence waned, and Japanese pilots approached combat with the grim realization that their survival odds were decreasing with each sortie. The American floating airstrips had evolved beyond mere ships. They had become emblems of inevitability, a horizon filled with steel decks and roaring engines that offered no respite. For the Japanese airmen, the Solomons represented more than just a battlefield. They were the graveyard of hope, where the myth of superiority lay buried beneath the looming presence of carriers that never ceased to emerge. The shattering awareness of American carrier supremacy reached its most dramatic climax at Midway, and in the subsequent months. For Japanese naval aviators, the battle signified not only a catastrophic loss of vessels and comrades, but also the moment when the illusion of invincibility crumbled into fear. Prior to June 1942, the Japanese had perceived carriers as their decisive advantage, the sword with which they would forge an empire across the Pacific. However, at Midway, they realized that the United States could wield the same weapon with devastating effectiveness, and that those floating airstrips would determine the war's future. In the lead-up to the battle, Japanese pilots were buoyed by the confidence derived from Pearl Harbor and the swift expansion throughout Asia. They anticipated luring the remaining American carriers into a trap, sinking them, and achieving dominance over the Pacific. Yet what transpired was a nightmare. From the skies above Midway, Japanese aviators witnessed waves of American dive bombers descending with remarkable precision, striking their carriers in rapid succession. In a single afternoon, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted into flames, followed later by Hiryu. For those who escaped the infernos, the experience was indelibly etched into their memories. The very instrument of Japanese naval superiority had been wrested from their grasp and turned against them. The psychological shock was profound. Survivors recounted feelings of disbelief, questioning how the Americans had launched so many planes with such remarkable coordination. Many believed that the enemy likely possessed significantly more carriers than what intelligence had indicated. Others speculated that American shipyards were producing replacements at an incomprehensible rate. Regardless of the reason, the conclusion was inescapable. The United States had demonstrated that its carriers were not merely a fragile collection of ships, but rather a burgeoning force capable of delivering devastating strikes. For the pilots who continued to fly in the wake of Midway, each mission was overshadowed by that loss. They approached American task forces with heightened caution, recognizing that the floating airstrips they encountered could just as easily inflict destruction as they could endure it. The The previous assurance that superior Japanese training and audacity would always triumph was beginning to fade. Now there was apprehension, a growing realization that the Americans were learning, adapting, and producing at a rate that Japan could not keep pace with. Midway did not signify the end of the Japanese carrier fleet, but it marked a pivotal moment in the perceptions of those who served under the rising sun. In subsequent campaigns, especially in the Central Pacific, Japanese aviators observed that American carriers were arriving in greater numbers and with enhanced tactics. The task force system, refined after Midway, ensured that carriers operated in formations protected by destroyers and cruisers, overlapping their air patrols to create nearly impenetrable defenses. For Japanese pilots attempting to reach those flat decks, it felt akin to flying into a fortress adrift on the ocean. The strategic ramifications were as catastrophic as the emotional ones. Midway had not only obliterated ships, but also shattered the illusion of Japanese supremacy. Each new encounter reinforced the reality that the Americans had taken the initiative. For the pilots dispatched into combat, this translated to fighting in an environment of perpetual uncertainty. Where they had once been the hunters, confident in their ability to strike at will, they were now the hunted, perpetually alert to the possibility of the next American carrier strike. A Japanese aviator later reflected on how the lessons learned from Midway haunted every subsequent mission. "We believed we would dominate the seas," he stated. "Instead, the ocean transformed into their territory, populated with their floating islands. We could never evade them." The battle exposed more than just tactical misfortune. It highlighted the larger disparity in resources and innovation that had doomed Japan's efforts from the outset. By the conclusion of 1942 and into 1943, Midway had evolved into a symbol for Japanese aviators, a warning permanently etched in their memories. The Americans' floating airstrips were not merely a transient threat, but rather the new cornerstone of naval warfare. Every horizon could hide another task force. Every cloud bank might conceal the approach of American dive bombers. For the men who ventured into those uncertain skies, the turning point at Midway represented more than just a historical event. It served as a living reminder that the war had slipped from Japan's control, and that the era of carrier supremacy had shifted to the United States. By the war's final years, Japanese naval aviators had descended into a state of desperation that no amount of training or propaganda could disguise. The floating airstrips of the United States, those expansive mobile carriers that seemed to emerge across the Pacific like steel islands, had shattered the backbone of Japan's once mighty air force. For the pilots who endured Guadalcanal, Midway, and the Solomons, the later years of the war introduced a grim new reality. The carriers were omnipresent, and there was no conventional method to overcome them. From this despair arose the most desperate tactic of all, the kamikaze. For men raised in the traditions of Bushido and sacrifice, the idea of giving one's life in battle was not foreign. However, the specific decision to intentionally crash into enemy ships was a direct result of the carrier's dominance. Japanese aviators understood that their dwindling numbers and outdated aircraft could not possibly compete with the relentless waves emanating from American decks. Conventional bombing raids were being decimated by interceptors and anti-aircraft fire, while torpedo assaults failed to penetrate the concentric rings of defense. Confronted with this insurmountable challenge, commanders implored their young pilots to become living weapons, sacrificing their lives for a chance to sink the floating airstrips that had tormented them for years. The initial kamikaze attacks stunned the Americans, inflicting damage on several carriers and resulting in the deaths of hundreds of sailors. However, the psychological impact was even more profound among the Japanese themselves. Pilots who once envisioned returning from missions to receive honor and glory now resigned themselves to the reality that their final flight would culminate in flames against a steel deck. Diaries retrieved after the war reveal the anguish of these men. Some accepted the notion with stoic determination, writing that their sacrifice might help balance the scales against an enemy with boundless resources. Others expressed their fear, acknowledging that they were being sent to their deaths because their leaders had no alternative to counter the carrier's supremacy. For American sailors and pilots, the kamikaze threat was terrifying, yet it never truly impeded the fleet's momentum. Damage control teams became proficient at containing fires, patching decks, and returning ships to operational status within days. Pilots and gunners honed their skills in identifying the suicide planes and neutralizing them before impact. Most devastating for Japan, even when kamikazes succeeded in hitting carriers, the Americans always appeared to have more ready to follow. For Japanese aviators, this represented the cruelest irony. Even in death, their sacrifices could not eliminate the floating airstrips from the ocean. The kamikaze strategy highlighted the extent to which the war had been transformed. In the early days, Japanese pilots had soared with confidence, believing that skill and audacity would lead them to victory. By 1944 and 1945, the very same individuals had been reduced to human bombs, launching themselves at an enemy that never seemed to falter. The carriers, once perceived as delicate flat tops susceptible to a fortunate strike, had demonstrated their resilience and permanence. They endured assaults, mended damages, replaced lost aircraft, and advanced with unwavering determination. This urgency unveiled a more profound reality. Japan's naval air force was no longer engaged in a conflict of equals. It found itself ensnared in an unbalanced battle against an industrial and logistical powerhouse. The kamikaze pilots may have represented bravery, yet bravery could not alter the course of history. American floating airstrips, supported by factories located thousands of miles away, were transforming the essence of warfare. They had evolved into the mobile representation of power projection, and no act of sacrifice, no matter how honorable, could reverse their momentum. As the war approached its concluding phases, Japanese aviators began to perceive the carriers not merely as military objectives, but as emblems of their nation's looming defeat. Each new report of American fleets advancing, each laden with carriers, underscored the futility of resistance. The Pacific, once imagined as Japan's empire of islands, had instead turned into a sea of American airfields. For the men commanded to perish in kamikaze missions, it felt as though the horizon itself had turned against them, filled with steel decks and countless aircraft, an unyielding barrier of power that no human resolve could dismantle. Ultimately, the kamikaze was not a symbol of Japanese strength, but rather a testament to the overwhelming supremacy of America's floating airstrips. The pilots who met their end in flames embodied a tragic reality. Their sacrifice stemmed not from choice, but from despair. It was a final effort to strike at an adversary whose carriers had already claimed the Pacific as their territory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Japanese aviators who survived the Pacific War reflected on their experiences with a blend of disbelief and bitterness. For them, the war had been a lesson inscribed in fire across the ocean. A revelation emerged that America's carriers, those immense floating airstrips, were not solely instruments of warfare, but rather the manifestation of an entirely new approach to conducting war. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, these carriers had converted the Pacific into an American stronghold, projecting air power over distances once deemed unachievable. For the Japanese pilots who battled against them, the carriers became emblems of inevitability, spectral islands that could materialize anywhere, bringing with them squadrons that appeared limitless. In post-war reflections and accounts, numerous Japanese aviators depicted the carriers in almost legendary terms. Some recounted the unsettling experience of encountering American aircraft in skies devoid of any land base, leading them to believe that the ocean itself had birthed these floating islands. Others recounted the despair that arose from witnessing carriers withstand blow after blow, only to return to combat even more formidable than before. In their narratives, the carriers were phantoms of steel, impossible to completely sink, multiplying at a rate faster than Japan could hope to eliminate them. The legacy of this experience influenced more than mere memories. It shaped military thought across the globe. For Japan, the carriers epitomized the critical error of underestimating an industrial power capable of not only replacing losses, but also expanding far beyond pre-war expectations. For the United States, they served as evidence that the combination of mobility and air power on the decks of ships could surpass even the most formidable battleships. The long-standing doctrine that had governed naval strategy for centuries, where surface artillery dictated supremacy, was overshadowed by the reality that air wings launched from floating airstrips could strike more swiftly, farther, and with greater accuracy than any broadside. To the Japanese pilots, who had held a belief in their own superiority, this transformation was catastrophic. Many acknowledged after the war that their culture of valor and sacrifice, while commendable, could not compete with the vast scale of American production. The floating airstrips were more than just military platforms. They represented extensions of an industrial machine that overshadowed Japan's capabilities. Each time a carrier emerged on the horizon, it served as a reminder that they were not merely battling ships, but an entire nation mobilized for warfare. The despair was intensified by the realization that the conflict had compelled them to adopt increasingly futile tactics. The kamikaze missions, born out of desperation, underscored how completely the carriers had shattered their resolve. Even as they drove their planes into steel decks, the carriers withstood the assault, mended their damages, and continued to launch aircraft. The sacrifices made by Japanese pilots, once anticipated to galvanize victory, instead highlighted the futility of their efforts. Their final confrontations unveiled a truth from which they could not escape. America's floating airstrips had irrevocably altered the landscape of warfare. In the subsequent years, as Japan reconstructed itself under occupation, surviving aviators frequently recounted their experiences with the carriers, often expressing a sense of haunted respect. They recalled them not merely as adversaries, but as emblems of a new era. One former pilot noted in his memoir that they fought against islands that moved and could not be subdued. They were not ships. They were nations adrift. Such reflections illuminate the profound psychological impact left by those encounters. The influence of America's carriers extended well beyond the Pacific. During the Cold War and thereafter, the idea of the floating airstrip became pivotal to the projection of U.S. power. In times of crisis, carriers would appear, bringing with them the same sense of inevitability that had previously shattered Japanese morale. For those men who had once plunged toward those decks under enemy fire, witnessing carriers in subsequent conflicts served as a stark reminder of their past experiences. Ultimately, the narrative of Japanese pilots facing America's floating airstrips is not merely a story of defeat in wartime, but also a significant lesson regarding the future of warfare. It illustrates how swiftly assumptions can disintegrate when faced with innovation and scale. The Japanese entered the conflict with a belief in the superiority of their own carriers. However, they concluded it with the realization that the Americans had outstripped them in every aspect. In their memories, the floating airstrips transformed from mere tools of destruction to the very embodiment of modern naval power. Phantoms at sea, reshaping history through steel and fire.